Before today's video, we want to bring you a word from our amazing sponsor, Untitled. With the holidays coming up, why not give someone something unique that comes once a month in the mail? Untitled subscription boxes are like escape rooms that you play in your very own home. With every Untitled box, you examine evidence like audio recordings and case files, and then you eliminate suspects until you crack the case and catch the killer. Untitled is a perfect gift for anyone who loves mysteries and puzzles. Or order it for yourself. It's great to play alone or get some friends to come over and play with you. Right now, Untitled is giving away a Killer Cocktails recipe book with a season pass. I'm obsessed with Untitled and I play it anytime I get a chance. All the props are really high quality and the storyline is incredible, so it makes me feel like I'm a character on a TV crime show. The best part is that right now, just for criminally listed viewers, if you go to huntitkiller.com/criminally listed and you use the promo code criminally listed, you'll get 20% off your first box. And once again, just make sure you use the promo code criminally listed for a 20% discount. When you get Untitled, you're not only getting someone an awesome gift, you'll also be help supporting criminally listed. The only thing you have to ask yourself, do you have what it takes to hunt a killer? Number 3. Tammy Marquardt. Tammy Wynn lived in Oshawa, Ontario, which is a city just east of Toronto. In May 1991, she was 19 years old and she gave birth to her first child. It was a son whom she named Kenneth Wynn. Tammy and Kenneth's father dated for a while after Kenneth was born, but the relationship didn't last. Not long after they broke up, Tammy started dating and eventually married an ex-boyfriend named Rick Marquardt. Their relationship was punctuated with domestic violence. Also, Kenneth was a sick baby. He had asthma. Then in January 1992, he contracted pneumonia. He was then diagnosed with epilepsy. Because of his epilepsy, he was hospitalized several times. On several occasions, Tammy brought him to the hospital for sick kids in Toronto. Kenneth's visits to the hospital were not limited to his illnesses. On September 9, 1993, when Kenneth was 2, he and his stepfather were playing on the patio of their home. Kenneth fell and broke his leg. Because of the broken leg, Kenneth ended up staying in the hospital for a little less than a month. Tammy acknowledged that she had problems taking care of Kenneth. She told one social worker that sometimes she blacked out. She told another social worker that one time, when Kenneth wouldn't stop crying, she placed her hand over his mouth. One of the social workers suggested putting Kenneth into foster care, but Tammy refused. She explained she was just exhausted and she was worrying about falling asleep while she was doing something like feeding him. Neither social worker saw any need to take any further action. Then in January 1993, Tammy paid a visit to the offices of the Children's Aid Society. She wanted to put Kenneth, who was 20 months old, into foster care. Tammy explained to the caseworker that her living situation wasn't good and her husband beat her. Tammy said that she was stressed out and she was worried that she may harm Kenneth. Kenneth was placed into foster care for 3 months and then he was given back to Tammy. In July 1993, Tammy moved into a YMCA with Kenneth. She moved because she wanted to escape her violent husband. A supervisor at the YMCA noticed that Kenneth had a bruise on his leg and she reported it to the Children's Aid Society. After a few weeks at the YMCA, Tammy moved back in with her abusive husband. On October 9, 1993, at 4:38 p.m., Tammy called 911. Kenneth, who was 2.5 years old, was not breathing. The 911 dispatcher told Tammy to perform CPR, but she was so panicked because her son wasn't breathing that she couldn't follow the dispatcher's directions. An ambulance arrived several minutes later, and they found Kenneth's lifeless body on the couch. He was rushed to the local hospital. Kenneth was in a coma, so after a few hours, he was transferred to Sick Kids in Toronto. After Kenneth was taken away in the ambulance, the police picked up Tammy. But instead of taking Tammy to be with her child, the police questioned her. She denied having anything to do with her son's state. Tammy said she put him down on the couch for a nap and then she had to rest herself. When she got up, she heard Kenneth calling for her. She went into the room where he was sleeping and found him tangled up in the blankets. Tammy said when she got to Kenneth, he wasn't breathing. She said that the blankets were wrapped so tightly around him, she almost cut them off. But she was worried about cutting Kenneth in the process. Tammy also explained to the police that her son had epilepsy. After several hours of being interviewed, Tammy was finally allowed to see her son, who was in a deep coma. 3 days after he was brought to the hospital, Kenneth was declared brain dead. Tammy decided to have his organs donated in the hopes of saving other children. 2.5-year-old Kenneth Wynn was pronounced dead on October 12, 1993. The autopsy was performed by the head pediatric forensic pathologist at Sick Kids, Dr. Charles Smith. Smith was highly respected and considered infallible. Some lawyers thought it was better to take a plea deal as Smith was testifying against them because he was so credible. Smith concluded that Kenneth had been asphyxiated to death. He had either been strangled or smothered. The only suspect was Tammy. In the past, she had admitted she was worried that she might harm Kenneth. Also, she was the only one home when Kenneth stopped breathing. Tammy was charged with murder on November 23, 1993. She was then released on bail while she awaited her trial. While she was on bail, she became pregnant by her husband, Rick. She gave birth in August 1994. It was a boy whom they named Keith. But not long after he was born, the Children's Aid Society took him into their custody. Shortly after that happened, Rick left Tammy. Tammy then started dating another man, and once again, she became pregnant. Tammy's trial was scheduled for the fall of 1995. Before her trial, she was offered a plea deal. If she pleaded guilty to manslaughter, she would only be sentenced to 5 years of prison. Tammy rejected the plea deal because she said she was innocent. When Tammy went to trial, she was visibly pregnant. At her trial, the social workers and the caseworker from the Children's Aid Society testified against her. Dr. Charles Smith also testified that Kenneth had been strangled or smothered to death. Tammy was ultimately convicted of second-degree murder. She was sentenced to life with a possibility of parole after 10 years. After Tammy was convicted, her son, Keith, was placed into foster care. She was sent to the prison for women in Kingston, Ontario. Not long after she was sent to prison, she gave birth at a hospital in Kingston. It was another boy. Tammy named him Eric. But within 24 hours of his birth, Eric was placed into the custody of the Children's Aid Society. Often, in women's prisons, women who kill kids, especially their own children, are hated by the other inmates. They are the target of harassment and violence, and often they are isolated because no one wants to associate with them. When Tammy was first processed, a guard suggested that she lie about why she was in prison for her own safety. But it wasn't long before the other inmates learned that Tammy had been convicted of killing her toddler son. She was soon bullied and tormented. In 1997, Tammy was transferred to a different prison, which was in Kitchener, Ontario. Unfortunately, she faced the same problems that she did in her old prison. Tammy first appealed her conviction about 3 years into her sentence in January 1998. She lost her appeal. Not long afterward, she found out that her 2 sons had been adopted and she was not allowed to have contact with them. 6 months after Tammy lost her appeal, she tried to overdose on pills. She was rushed to the hospital and she survived. After her suicide attempt, Tammy decided that she wanted to live. She wanted to get out of prison and one day reconnect with her 2 sons. In 2004, Tammy was connected with a lawyer with the Association in Defense of the Wrongly Convicted. The lawyer agreed to work on her case. In June 2005, 10 years after Tammy was convicted, she started to leave prison on day passes. Tammy found life outside the prison difficult. Because of her criminal record, she had problems finding work. Also, she felt that the world had changed so much in the decade that she had spent in prison. Tammy went to prison in 1995 when cell phones and the internet weren't as commonplace. She was also still haunted by the death of her son and the loss of the 2 other sons who were adopted. Tammy eventually turned to drugs and alcohol. She was given a drug test and cocaine was found in her system. So in the autumn of 2006, her parole was revoked and she lost her day pass privileges. She was paroled 2 more times over the next year, and both times her parole was revoked and she was sent back to prison. Around the same time that Tammy was struggling with her parole, the reputation of a key person in her arrest and conviction was crumbling. That was Dr. Charles Smith, the pathologist who performed Kenneth's autopsy. Smith became the head pediatric forensic pathologist at Sick Kids in 1982. As early as 1988, there were complaints about him, and his conclusions started to be questioned. As the years went on, the complaints about him piled up. The province's chief coroner and the deputy coroner were both aware of the complaints, but they did nothing about them. In 2001, the deputy coroner, who was Charles Smith's direct supervisor, resigned. His replacement became aware of the complaints against Smith, and he suspended Smith from doing autopsies. In June 2005, a review of autopsies performed by Smith was conducted. A month later, Smith resigned from Sick Kids. In November 2005, it was announced that there were 44 suspicious cases. As they started reviewing the cases, they added a 45th case, the death of Kenneth Wynn. It turned out that Charles Smith had not been trained to do autopsies when a crime was suspected. He had only been trained to study disease in children. Smith also had a mindset that was described as "think dirty." Basically, he started on the presumption that someone was guilty, and then he would look for evidence that would back that theory up. But Smith went way further with this attitude. Since these people had killed children, bending or breaking the rules was worth it because the ends would justify the means. So Smith used junk science, hid evidence, and even lied to prove that people were guilty. Out of the 45 cases that were reviewed, the investigators found major flaws in 20 of the cases. Of the 20 cases, there were 13 cases where someone was convicted based on Smith's mistakes. The review led to a public inquiry. The report based on the inquiry was released in October 2008. A major case that was detailed in the report was Tammy Marquardt's second-degree murder conviction. Another pathologist who reviewed Smith's autopsy report of Kenneth said that it had errors and it was misleading and unprofessional. The pathologist who did the review thought that Kenneth most likely died as a result of a seizure that was brought on by his epilepsy. In February 2009, Tammy appealed her case again. On March 12, 2009, Tammy was released from prison while the Supreme Court reviewed her case. She has spent 13 years and 8 months in prison. The Supreme Court reviewed her case and then sent it to the Court of Appeals. It took 2 years, but in June 2011, Tammy's conviction was overturned and she was ordered to stand trial again. But the charges against her were dropped before she could go to trial again. In February 2011, about 4 months before Tammy's conviction was quashed, Charles Smith was stripped of his medical license. Of the 13 known cases that Smith worked on that led to a wrongful conviction, Tammy spent the most time in prison. For spending nearly 14 years in prison and having 2 of her sons taken away from her and being put up for adoption, Tammy was paid $250,000 from the province of Ontario. Tammy sued Charles Smith, but the outcome of the lawsuit could not be found. It is not believed that Tammy has reconnected with her sons who were put up for adoption. Number 2. Lynn DeJack. Lynn DeJack lived in Buffalo, New York, and she had her first child in 1979 when she was 16 years old. It was a daughter whom she named Crystal Lynn. Lynn later got married to Crystal Lynn's father, Roger Gerard. Lynn gave birth again 5 years after Crystal Lynn was born. It was a son whom they named Edward. In the late 1980s, Lynn moved to Nevada to look for work. Roger stayed in Buffalo with Crystal Lynn and Edward. In the early 1990s, Crystal Lynn told her neighbors that her father was sexually abusing her. The neighbors went to the police. Roger was arrested and charged. He pleaded not guilty at his trial in July 1991. Crystal Lynn testified against him. Roger was convicted and he was sentenced to 5 to 15 years in prison. Before his trial, Lynn moved back to Buffalo to take care of her children. But several people did not think that Lynn did much in the way of mothering. They thought that she went out partying too much. Lynn was known to drink excessively and do cocaine. She'd also stay out all night. This affected Crystal Lynn, who had to grow up too quickly. She was often the one who took care of her brother, Edward. Despite the trouble Crystal Lynn had in life, she did well in school and she became an honor student. In February 1993, Crystal Lynn was 13 and Edward was 8. Lynn was 30 and she had been dating 43-year-old bartender Dennis Donahue. They had been dating for about 2 months. On the night before Valentine's Day 1993, Lynn and Donahue went to a wedding. They drank and did drugs. Then they started to argue. On the way home, Lynn told Donahue that their relationship was over. Donahue wasn't happy about it, and when they got to Lynn's home, he followed her inside. In the house, they continued to fight. This woke up Crystal Lynn, who got out of bed to see what the commotion was. Lynn called the police, and then Donahue left. Instead of waiting for the police, Lynn decided to go to a bar that was on the same block as their home. The bar was owned by Lynn's mother. Before Lynn left, she told Crystal Lynn not to answer the door when the police arrived. When the police knocked on the door 15 minutes later, no one answered the door, so the officers left. At the bar that night was Lynn's ex-boyfriend, a man named Michael Nichter. Lynn started flirting with him. Donahue came into the bar and saw them flirting. He did not like it. Donahue supposedly held a Swiss Army knife to Nichter's throat. The scuffle was broken up before anyone got hurt, and Donahue left the bar. Lynn and Nichter left the bar together after the fight, and they went to Lynn's home. Lynn went into Crystal Lynn's bedroom and left a cordless phone there. She also placed the family dog in the bedroom. Then she and Nichter went back to his home. The next afternoon, Lynn came home and found her daughter's lifeless body in her bed. Crystal Lynn was lying face up and she was nude. 911 was called, but it was too late to do anything for the 13-year-old. The pathologist concluded that Crystal Lynn had been strangled to death. He also found what he thought was a small amount of cocaine in her system. An early suspect in the case was Dennis Donahue. The police thought that he may have killed Crystal Lynn as a way to punish Lynn. Donahue denied having anything to do with Crystal Lynn's murder. He took a polygraph test and he passed. For 6 months, not much progress was made on the case. Then the police arrested a man named Wayne Hudson for committing a felony. Hudson had a criminal record and he was looking at a possible life sentence because he was a repeat offender. Hudson was a childhood friend of Linda Jack. Hudson told the police that he had been drinking at the same bar as Lynn on the night before Crystal Lynn's body was found. He claimed that Lynn had confessed to him that she had killed her daughter. He claimed that Lynn said she was high and drunk and she just lost it. 11 months after the murder, Lynn was arrested and charged with second-degree murder and manslaughter. Dennis Donahue testified in front of the grand jury. He talked about how much Lynn drank the night her daughter died and the fights that they had. Because of a state law, in exchange for his testimony, Donahue was granted immunity regarding the death of Crystal Lynn Gerard. Lynn went to trial in April 1994. When she went to trial, she was pregnant with twin boys. At the trial, Wayne Hudson testified that Lynn had confessed to him. The district attorney presented evidence that Lynn was an unfit mother. They pointed out that Lynn drank, she did drugs, she was promiscuous, and some nights she didn't come home to her children. Lynn's defense wanted to bring up that there was cocaine found in Crystal Lynn's system and suggest that the cocaine led to Crystal Lynn's death. The problem was that the medical examiner said that the amount of cocaine in her system would not have been lethal. Also, Lynn did not want the defense to bring that up. She did not want to make it look like her dead daughter was a drug addict just to benefit herself. There was no forensic evidence that Lynn had anything to do with her daughter's murder. She also had an alibi for the entire night. Nevertheless, in April 1994, she was convicted of second-degree murder. 2 months later, she was sentenced to life in prison. Lynn gave birth to her twin sons in prison. Supposedly, because Lynn insisted she was innocent, she was not allowed to see her twin sons after they were born. The boys were raised by their father, Chuck Peters. Over 13 years after Lynn DeJack was convicted, in 2007, a Buffalo homicide detective named Dennis Delano was in a Bible study group. A woman who was in the group found out that Delano was a detective and he often reviewed cold cases. She told him about the murder of her sister, Joan Giambra. On September 9, 1993, 42-year-old Joan was found dead in her home. The unconscious body of her 11-year-old daughter, Kathleen, was lying on top of her. They were both lying face up, they were nude, and they had been strangled. Kathleen was taken to the hospital, and she survived her injuries. She did not remember anything from the attack. Joan's sister told Detective Delano that the case was cold. Delano agreed to look into Joan's murder. Male DNA had been found at the crime scene, but it had not been matched to anyone. The first person that Delano wanted to talk to was Joan's estranged husband, Sam Giambra. Months before Joan was murdered, she and Sam had split up, and Joan planned on serving him with divorce papers. Then Delano learned that Sam had died by suicide in 2000. However, the pathologist had saved a sample of his DNA. It was compared to the DNA of Joan's killer. It was not a match. Delano talked to members of Joan's family, and they remembered around the time of the murder, she had been dating a guy named Dennis Donahue. Delano and some cold case investigators then began to look into other cold cases. They found one that happened on September 9, 1975, 18 years before Joan was killed. 51-year-old Susan Reed was found dead in her apartment. She was found lying face up, naked, and she had been strangled to death. When she was killed, Dennis Donahue lived in an apartment down the hallway from her. Reed told people that Donahue had made advances towards her. The police considered him a person of interest and they questioned him. Donahue denied having anything to do with the murder, and there was no evidence that connected him to the crime. So he remained a person of interest, but he was never arrested. Then Detective Delano knows a striking similarity between the two murders. Carol Reed and Joan Giambra were both killed on September 9th. This fact was amazing because Dennis Donahue's birthday is September 9th, 1952. The odds that both women were killed on the same day, which happened to be Donahue's birthday, were astronomical. Detective Delano also learned that Donahue had dated Crystal Lynn Gerard's mother, Linda Jack, when Crystal Lynn was killed. Crystal Lynn died 7 months before Joan Giambra and her daughter were attacked. Detective Delano decided to track down Dennis Donahue. He found him living with relatives and he was unemployed. Delano got a sample of Donahue's DNA. Unfortunately, no physical evidence from Carol Reed's 1975 murder could be found. So Donahue's DNA was compared to male DNA found under Joan Giambra's fingernails. It was a match. Donahue's DNA was also compared to DNA found in Crystal Lynn's bedroom. This included DNA that was found on the bedding and a smear of Crystal Lynn's blood that was found on the wall and inside of Crystal Lynn. It matched as well. The problem was that Donahue could never be charged in connection with Crystal Lynn's death. Because of state law, Donahue had immunity because he testified against Linda Jack in front of the grand jury. But this evidence did help Linda Jack. Something else happened in 2007 that would help Lynn. The main reason the police started to suspect that Lynn killed her daughter was because her childhood friend, Wayne Hudson, told the police that she had confessed to him. At her trial, there was no physical evidence. The prosecutor described her as a bad mother, and Hudson testified that she confessed. So Hudson's testimony was an essential reason as to why Lynn was convicted. In 2007, Hudson recanted his accusation. He said that Lynn had never confessed to him. On November 28, 2007, Lynn's conviction was vacated. She was released from prison after spending 13 and a half years incarcerated. A new trial was ordered. But then, in February 2008, the district attorney disclosed some information that completely rocked the case. Another pathologist, Dr. Michael Baden, had reviewed photos of the body in the autopsy report. He said that Crystal Lynn had not been murdered. Instead, she overdosed on cocaine. Dr. Baden said there was sufficient cocaine in her blood to cause death and no other competing cause of death. Baden also pointed out that there were very few injuries in the neck area. There was a thin bruise on her neck that looked like a thumbprint, but that was it. Often, when someone is strangled to death, their thyroid bone is broken. Crystal Lynn's thyroid bone was undamaged. Also, fluids were found in her lungs, and that is common in drug overdoses. Dr. Baden pointed out that there was a bruise on Crystal Lynn's face. Also, there was a broken table in her bedroom. Dr. Baden said that Crystal might have been having an overdose and she fell into the table, bruising her face. Dr. Baden concluded that Crystal Lynn's death was non-homicidal. 2 weeks after Dr. Baden's findings were made public, the charges against Lynn were dismissed. Neither Lynn nor Detective Delano agree with Dr. Baden's conclusion. Lynn said that her daughter was not a drug addict. Delano pointed out that the DNA evidence put Dennis Donahue there that night, and he was the prime suspect in 2 murders. Whether Lynn or Delano believed the findings to be accurate or not, it had no effect on the outcome because Dennis Donahue could not be charged in connection with Crystal Lynn's death. In May 2008, 55-year-old Dennis Donahue went to trial for the only murder he could be charged with, the killing of Joan Giambra. He was found guilty and he was sentenced to 25 years to life. After Lynn was released from prison, she married Chuck Peters, who was the father of the twin she gave birth to while she was in prison. She also changed her last name to Peters. Lynn filed a $14.5 million lawsuit against the state of New York. She ended up agreeing to a settlement of $2.7 million in November 2012. Sadly, a month after that, which was 5 years after she was released from prison, Lynn Peters was diagnosed with cancer. The cancer was in her lungs and her spine. Lynn passed away on June 18, 2014, at the age of 50. The Innocence Project says that Lynn Peters was the first woman to be exonerated of murder with DNA evidence. Number 1. James Joseph Richardson. Arcadia is a small town in DeSoto County, Florida. It is an area known for growing citrus and watermelon. In 1967, about 5,500 people were living in Arcadia. 31-year-old James Joseph Richardson lived there with his third wife, Annie Mae Richardson. They lived in an apartment with 7 children. 2 of the children, 8-year-old Betty and 6-year-old Susie, were Annie Mae's daughters from a previous relationship. 7-year-old Alice was Richard's daughter from one of his earlier marriages. Then they had 4 children together, 5-year-old Doreen, 4-year-old Vanessa, 3-year-old Diane, and 2-year-old James Jr. The family had recently moved to Arcadia from Daytona Beach, Florida. James and Annie Mae had found work picking oranges for 25 cents a crate. On the morning of October 25, 1967, at 6:40 a.m., James and Annie Mae got on a bus that went to the orange grove where they worked. The orange grove was about 14 miles from their home. Later that morning, Betty, who was the oldest child living in the home, fed her siblings at breakfast with chicken sandwiches and grits. Then the 5 oldest children left for school. Their next-door neighbor, Dorothy Bracey, was supposed to babysit the 2 youngest children. But that morning, Bracey had to take her own children to the doctors. So her mother, Bessie Reese, watched the 2 youngest Richardson children. Betty, Susie, Alice, Vanessa, and Diane returned home for lunch. Bessie Reese warmed up and served the 7 children some beans and rice that their mother had made for them the night before. After lunch, the 5 oldest children went back to school. Less than an hour after they returned to school, one of them got seriously ill. She was writhing in pain and foaming at the mouth. Soon, the other 4 children were writhing and foaming at the mouth. Several teachers decided to rush them to the hospital. Another teacher went to the family's apartment to check on the other 2 children. When she got there, Bessie Reese was holding one of the children and the other child was lying on the ground. Both children were convulsing and foam was coming out of their mouth. Those two children joined their siblings at the hospital. James and Annie Mae were notified that only one of their children had been hospitalized, and they got to the hospital right away. By the time they arrived at the hospital, 6 of their 7 children had died. The sheriff of DeSoto County, Frank Klein, questioned James and Annie Mae before they found out what happened to their children. They answered all of Sheriff Klein's questions, and then James handed over the keys to their apartment. Their refrigerator was also locked, so James gave Sheriff Klein the key to the refrigerator. After they talked to Sheriff Klein, James and Annie Mae were informed that 6 of their children had died, and the 7th child was in critical condition. The 7th child died the next day. The hospital staff concluded that the children had most likely been poisoned. When Sheriff Klein went to the family's apartment, he could smell the insecticide parathion. It turned out that the deadly insecticide had been sprinkled all over the home. On the same morning that the 7th child died, the sheriff's department was called to the Richardsons' apartment. A bag of parathion had been found in the shed behind the family's apartment. What is known is that the bag of parathion was not in the shed on the day the children got sick. The sheriff, the chief of police, the district attorney, and all their staff members agree that the bag wasn't in the shed the day before. On the day the children were poisoned, the property had been searched 5 times, and the bag of parathion was not there. The parathion had been found by a man who was known as the town drunk, and Bessie Reese, the woman who babysat the 2 youngest children and fed all the children lunch. News of the 7 murders attracted reporters from all over the country. A lot of their attention was focused on the sheriff's department. DeSoto County is mostly a rural county, and at the time, it only had a population of about 11,000 people. Anytime Sheriff Klein would talk to members of the press, he would give explosive updates, including clues that had been found. For example, he told the press that the night before the murders, a life insurance salesman had knocked on the family's door. Sheriff Klein told the reporters that he had interviewed the insurance salesman and he had found his business card inside the Richardsons' apartment. On the back of the business card, there were quotes for life insurance payouts for every member of the family. Sheriff Klein openly speculated that James killed the kids for the insurance money. 2 days after the funeral, James was arrested and charged with 7 counts of first-degree murder. Sheriff Klein was sure that James had killed his children for the insurance money. But the district attorney did not think that there was enough evidence to charge James with murder, so he dropped the charges and charged him and Annie Mae with neglect. The day after the murder charges were dropped, Sheriff Klein and the local judge, Lee Hayes, gave a press conference. At the press conference, Sheriff Klein claimed that while James was living in Florida City with his previous wife, 5 of his children died under mysterious circumstances. He also said that he knew that James killed his kids to get the life insurance money, which was about $3,500. Judge Hayes told the press that James had failed a lie detector test. Judge Hayes also said that he would be holding a coroner's jury the next day. Hayes invited the press to attend the hearing. For the hearing, Hayes was allowed to pick the jury. Hayes then told the jury that they were there to file murder charges against James Richardson. At the hearing, Sheriff Klein testified that 3 of James's children, whom he had in a previous marriage, had died under mysterious circumstances. He also testified that 3 of his other children had previously become dangerously ill. This is quite different from the claim he made the day before to the press when he said that 5 of James's children from a previous marriage had died under mysterious circumstances. Sheriff Klein also testified that the family's apartment smelled strongly of parathion. Then the principal of the school testified that the children got sick after returning to school after lunch. Bessie Reese testified that she warmed up and served the children lunch. She also testified that a man in the neighborhood found the parathion in the shed. Then the insurance salesman testified. He said that James had wanted to get a family life insurance policy, but there was a problem. James did not have the money to pay the premium. The salesman said he told James that the policy wouldn't take effect until he was paid the premium. But after he was pressed by the district attorney, the salesman said that it was possible that James did not understand that the insurance policy was not in effect. The hearing resulted in James being charged with 7 counts of murder. James Richardson went to trial in May 1968. Because of the publicity the case attracted, the trial was held in Fort Myers, which is in the county that neighbors DeSoto County. The district attorney devised a plan to ensure that James would be convicted. James's first trial was only for the murder of his eldest stepdaughter. If he were to be acquitted, they would simply keep trying him for each individual murder. The jury was all white, and several jurors were supposedly members of the Ku Klux Klan. 15 potential jurors were dismissed because they did not support the death penalty. 2 other potential jurors were dismissed because they said they couldn't convict someone on circumstantial evidence alone. At his trial, the district attorney argued that James killed his family for the insurance money. The DA also noted that a business card from the insurance salesman was found in his apartment. On the back of the business card, the insurance salesman had written out the payout amount for each family member. But notably, the life insurance salesman never testified. The DA also noted that the bag of parathion used to poison the children was found in the shed behind the family's apartment. 2 inmates who were in jail with James while he was awaiting his trial testified. They claimed that they heard James confess or he had talked about poisoning his children. In exchange for their testimony, they received lighter sentences. A 3rd inmate, Ernell Washington, had told a reporter that James had confessed to him. Washington was not able to testify because he had been shot and killed before the trial. But amazingly, the reporter that Washington had talked to was allowed to testify that Washington had told her that James had confessed to him. Then 2 other inmates testified that Washington told them that James had admitted to poisoning his children. James's lawyer argued that there was no physical evidence that James killed his kids. He also pointed out that when the children were poisoned, James was working 14 miles away in the orange grove. James's wife, Annie Mae, testified. James's lawyer asked about the accusation that he had 3 other children who died under mysterious circumstances. Annie Mae said that one of their children was stillborn. She also said that James had 2 other sons who died. But then the district attorney objected to her talking about those deaths. The district attorney argued that they had happened with one of James's other wives, so Annie Mae wasn't there to witness what happened. The judge agreed with the argument, and Annie Mae was not allowed to talk about what she knew about the deaths of James's other sons. So the jury heard that 2 of James's other sons had died, but they did not learn the circumstances of the deaths. Annie Mae and the other witnesses for the defense all testified that James was a family man who deeply loved his children. James testified, and he denied killing his kids. He admitted that 2 of his sons from a previous marriage had died, but he was not allowed to explain how they died. If he had been allowed, the jury would have learned that both deaths were ruled natural. The jury ended up deliberating for 83 minutes. They found James Joseph Richardson guilty, and he was sentenced to die in the electric chair. One person who was fascinated by the case was a lawyer named Mark Lane. In 1870, Lane published a book about the case entitled Arcadia. In the book, Lane pointed out several glaring problems with the case. For example, parathion was found in a pot in the sink. The pot had been used to cook grits. The problem is that the children ate the grits for breakfast and they did not get sick. That meant the parathion was sprinkled around the apartment after the children ate breakfast. It also meant that they most likely ate the poison at lunch. Also, parathion turns into a poisonous gas that has an unbearable odor when it is warmed up. That meant the parathion could not have been in the beans and rice before it was warmed up and served to the children. Had that been the case, the person who was warming up the rice and beans would have noticed something was wrong. It was most likely sprinkled onto their food after it was warmed up. This suggests that whoever served the children lunch was the person who poisoned them. That person was Bessie Reese. Reese was also one of the people who found the bag of parathion in the shed. In the book, Mark Lane also revealed that these weren't the only deaths connected to Reese. In 1952, Reese's first husband died after he ate some beef stew that Reese had made for him. Reese's second husband died in 1955. Reese shot him to death. She went to prison for the killing, but she was released in 1960. In fact, she was still on parole when she was babysitting the Richardson children. Yet, none of the authorities considered her a suspect. Lane even had a motive as to why Reese would want to hurt the Richardson family. Reese had a third husband, but a few weeks before the poisoning, he had left her to go be with James's cousin. While Mark Lane's book made a strong argument that James Richardson was innocent, it was more likely that Bessie Reese poisoned the children. Not much happened with the case. Some people believe that James's case might have attracted more attention had the book not been written by Mark Lane. Lane rose to fame for a book he published in 1966 called Rush to Judgment. It was the first major book to question the Warren Commission. The Warren Commission was the government's investigation of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. The report said that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone when he shot Kennedy. In Rush to Judgment, Lane argued that the Warren Commission's conclusion was implausible. Lane did not think it was possible that one bullet traveled through Kennedy and entered the chest of Texas Governor John B. Connally Jr., who was riding in the car with Kennedy and his wife. Lane also thought that there was a second gunman on the grassy knoll. Finally, Lane thought that Jack Ruby, the man who assassinated Lee Harvey Oswald, was part of a bigger conspiracy. The book was a massive bestseller, but many people criticized the book and thought that Lane was a crackpot. Another problem with Lane's involvement in James Richardson's case was that Lane was a media-hungry man who wanted a lot of attention for himself. As a result, not many people wanted to help with James's case. So while people thought that James was innocent, nothing happened. James continued to sit on death row. Then in June 1972, the United States Supreme Court ruled that capital punishment was cruel and unusual punishment. They subsequently suspended the death penalty. As a result, James's sentence was commuted to life in prison. As time went on, Mark Lane continued to work as a lawyer, and he wrote books about conspiracy theories. In September 1978, Lane was invited to the People's Temple Agricultural Project, which is better known by its informal name, Jonestown, in Guyana. Lane was personally invited by the leader of Jonestown, Jim Jones, and he traveled there in September 1978. According to an article in Mother Jones, Jim Jones told Lane about the failures in Jonestown, and he thought that the FBI and the CIA may have been sabotaging them. Jones then paid Lane $10,000 to file some Freedom of Information Act suits. After getting the money, Lane returned to the United States. Nearly a month later, on November 15th, Leo Ryan, a Democratic representative from California, traveled to Jonestown with some journalists and relatives of people who were living in Jonestown. Mark Lane got a seat on their plane. Lane was supposedly going to keep Jim Jones calm while Ryan and the journalists visited. 3 days later, on November 18, 1978, Ryan, the journalist, the relatives, and 16 members of the People's Temple who said they wanted to go back to the United States traveled to a nearby airstrip. While they were waiting for their plane, several members of the People's Temple opened fire on them. Leo Ryan, 3 journalists, and a person fleeing Jonestown were all shot and killed. Several other people were injured. Back at Jonestown, Jim Jones was leading a mass suicide and a mass murder. Contrary to popular belief, Jones did not serve poison Kool-Aid. Instead, it was cyanide-laced Flavor Aid. Many of his followers willingly drank the poison Flavor Aid. Others were force-fed the Flavor Aid, and some were injected with cyanide. Jones then took his own life by shooting himself in the head. When the chaos erupted, Mark Lane and another lawyer, Charles Gary, were taken and held in a house on the outskirts of Jonestown. Their guard told them that everyone was going to die. Lane told the guard to let them go so he could write about them. Lane said he would make everyone know how amazing the People's Temple was. This argument convinced the guard to let him and Gary go. The 2 lawyers ran into the jungle and eventually found help. Lane and Gary were 2 of 36 people who were in Jonestown on the day of the mass suicide who survived. 909 people died that day in Jonestown. Lane later published a book about his relationship with the People's Temple in that infamous day. Throughout most of the book, which is entitled The Strongest Poison, Lane tries to distance himself from Jones and the People's Temple. Then, in the spring of 1988, famed radio broadcaster Paul Harvey talked about James Richardson's case on his immensely popular radio segment, The Rest of the Story. It turned out that in the mid-1980s, Bessie Reese was placed in a nursing home and she had early onset Alzheimer's disease. Between 1985 and 1987, she admitted to poisoning the children hundreds of times. Sometimes she would sit in a chair and look out the window. She would keep repeating, "I killed the kids, I killed the kids, I killed the kids." One of the nursing home staff members asked her if she murdered the Richardson children. Reese supposedly said, "Yeah, I did." But when she asked Reese why she did it, Reese didn't say anything. This would happen whenever a staff member asked Reese for more details. She would shut down and be silent. Paul Harvey's story got the wheels rolling on James's case. After the story aired, Mark Lane got in contact with James and asked to be his attorney. James accepted his offer. In August 1988, Lane started a campaign to get James released. Around the same time, there was an unusual heist in DeSoto County. A man named Remus Griffin, who lived in Arcadia, heard that there was a secret file hidden in one of the desks in the district attorney's office. So Griffin decided to break into the district attorney's office, and he found the file. He then handed the file over to an editor at Tropic magazine. The file was full of exculpatory evidence from James Richardson's case. This included evidence that showed that James knew that the life insurance policy was not in effect. James knew he would have not been able to pay the premiums on the insurance policy. Also in the file, there were unedited transcripts of interviews with the jailhouse snitches. In the transcripts, the witnesses contradict each other. Then, in December 1988, Tropic magazine published an article about James's case. Then two reporters went to the governor's office. Since they didn't have an appointment, the governor wouldn't see them. But then the door to the governor's office opened, and one of the reporters, Peter Gallagher, rushed into his office. He gave the governor the evidence that had been hidden in the district attorney's office. The governor promised that he would look into it. In February 1989, the governor appointed Dade County District Attorney and future Attorney General Janet Reno as a special prosecutor on the case. A few months later, on April 25, 1989, a judge overturned James's conviction because of the suppressed evidence. On May 5, 1989, James was released from prison, and Janet Reno announced that the charges against him would be dismissed. James Joseph Richardson was 53 years old when he was released, and he had spent over 21 years in prison. This included about 4 years on death row. Bessie Reese died in 1992 without ever facing charges for the murders of the 7 children. James sued DeSoto County, and he ended up settling for $150,000. Most of that money went to pay the fees of the lawyers who exonerated him. James lived in poverty after he was released from prison. In 2008, Florida introduced a new bill that wrongly convicted people could be paid $50,000 for every year that they were wrongly imprisoned. But there was a special requirement in the bill. To qualify for the compensation, the person needed to be proven innocent. The problem was that there was evidence that James probably did not kill his children, but there was no definitive proof that he was innocent. A lot of that was due to the age of the crime. In the ensuing decades, a lot of evidence was lost or destroyed. Also, many of the witnesses had died. Another problem was that the original investigators did such a poor job with collecting evidence. 6 years later, in 2014, the state of Florida passed a new bill and allotted a payment of $50,000 for every year that James spent in prison. So he would be paid just over $1 million. James Joseph Richardson is 84 at the time of this video, and he lives in Wichita, Kansas with his fourth wife, Teresa. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Hopefully you found it interesting. If you did, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe for more videos just like it. Also, please check out criminalist.com where you can suggest cases, buy merch, and find out about an exclusive podcast. We're also on Facebook at facebook.com/criminallylisted. But that is all for today. Thank you again for watching.